I want to ask you, some of the filmmakers, instead of let's make a film, the Professor Searle was coming out with his device. We spoke with him. He's talking about the Searle free energy device, and we found it very interesting. Apparently, the machines were confiscated. Now he needs about $3 to $6 million to build one of these things, and they could power up a city. Why doesn't a filmmaker with a lot of money, big pocketbook, just easily flip out some money and build one of these machines?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, I've met with a lot of multi-billionaires and centimillionaires, and basically many of those people's idea is, show me a prototype and then I can get behind it. But it's like telling Oppenheimer, show me an atomic bomb and then we'll fund it. Well, you need, and not that this is an atomic bomb, but the point is that a lot of people want to see something operational. So no one wants to invest anymore in basic R&D, which is what you've got to do to get to something that's an operational prototype. On the other hand, people who stumble across this and get something working, they get a knock on the door if it's a little guy and they're obscure. So, it's a problem. And, I think we have to figure out a way around it.
Go ahead, Dr. Greer.
Well, I think the other thing, let's wrap up. You were asking me about some of these very wealthy movie and other billionaire-type people who, in terms of funding the energy research, I'll tell you a little story. A few years ago, I was meeting with a guy who was a multi-billionaire, and I asked him this. I said, look, he had 5 private jets, and occasionally he would take me places on one of them. And I say, look, the jet fuel you're blowing out of your tailpipe would fund everything we need to do for this energy effort. He says, yes, of course. He said, but it's too dangerous. I don't want to risk it. I'd be too identified. I said, do it through an offshore. Do it through an anonymous. He says, it wouldn't be anonymous. These people are going to track it. And I said, what are you afraid of? And he told me this story. He said, look, back in the late 60s, and this is a guy whose personal income, $750 million a year. Think about that. Okay, we need $6.3 million to do this lab for a 2-year period and develop one of these technologies based on all these brilliant people we know. So he said, look, I knew the head of General Motors back in the late 60s, or one of the chief executives. And I said, yeah. And he said, well, he told me that they had, sitting on a black shelf, a free energy device so that every GM car could be with an electric motor, never have to be plugged in, not like the Bolt. And that he felt that it was time to bring that out. 2 weeks later, this executive was found dead of an apparent suicide. Now, what this man told me was that there was no way this man committed suicide, that this was made to look like one. And so this guy was afraid of meeting that fate. The difference is, if you expect one person or a couple people to come forward, they know that there is a big national security buzzsaw that may chop them up. However, you say you have 120 subscribers. If each of those subscribers went to our site and every week put in the amount of a latte, $5, in 3 months we would have the $6.3 million. I've just calculated it. So what I say to people is that, why don't the people get behind this if they instead of just being entertained by this issue? People need to get serious. The pun intended, S-I-R-I-U-S, but also serious as in let's get serious, because instead of always looking for someone else, it's like everyone's always, it's like, in New York, someone's getting stabbed on the subway. Everyone's looking around for someone else to help them. Well, you know what? We need to start looking to ourselves, and we need to take responsibilities for ourselves and for our planet. That's what we've got to do, and that's the next step that has got to happen. It's happened with the CE5 contact efforts. It's happened with disclosure, but with the technology issue, it hasn't yet, and that's what's got to begin to happen.
We've been putting out information. We've been asking the top ufologists around the world, because we're trying to get the answer, to get our hands on a real alien body. Yours, the one in your possession, possibly could be the smoking gun, evidence out there of that we're not alone, but we want to get more evidence out there. But to actually obtain one of these things, do you think it would, be a national security issue? The government says they're not, following it. They've dropped the UFO investigative research, but wow.
Well, no, I mean, that's the government. It's like when they had this petition and asked the White House. The people who would respond to that or a normal FOIA request are not in the compartmented operations that deal with this. And the public has to understand, a top secret security clearance That and $1.50 gets you on the metro in D.C. There are 984,000 people with top secret security clearances. It's the compartment you're in. And what I mean by that is that once you hit a top secret or even secret clearance, you might be dealing with one issue. The person sitting next to you who can't tell you what they're dealing with may be in a compartment dealing with the ET issue. But that compartment is very tightly controlled, and it's much smaller than, say, people dealing with nuclear weapons. So I think that what the public has to understand is that when the government, I would say which government, there's this kind of parallel universe of super secret programs, and this is why, when I've met with people on the Senate Intelligence Committee and the CIA director and the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, which is almost as big as the CIA that's in the Pentagon, and the head of intelligence for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, these are all very senior people. And to a fault, every single one of them said, we've asked about this stuff, we're told nothing, but we suspect it's going on. Now, this is not just your John Q. Public bureaucrat responding to a FOIA request. These are generals and admirals and a CIA director that I personally have met with. And by the way, I'm the only person in the world that can come on your show and give you that and prove it and say what I'm saying. So there is this kind of deep national security state, but it's transnational cabal that is keeping it secret. So how do you go around that? Well, you need to get people to come forward, which we have, and get more people to come forward, like Gordon Cooper did. Now, on the issue of the hoaxing of things, this is something that you asked about PLS, what it stands for, a program life form. And beginning many decades ago, we developed a type of genetic cloning where they could simulate something that looks like an ET but isn't. And most people would be fooled by it, just like they would be fooled by one of Lockheed's anti-gravity propulsion devices, and they would think it's a, quote, well, it's a UFO because they don't know what it is, but it's not an ET craft. Similarly, there are these creatures that masquerade as ETs, but I call them aliens because I think alien is a xenophobic term like the N-word or the F-word for gay people. And so I always use the word ET and not alien because I think it's an intrinsically xenophobic negative term. But the point I'm making is that these creatures that have been made in a number of laboratories over the years and become better and better really do look like a non-human humanoid, but they're man-made. And these have been used in conjunction with these man-made anti-gravity devices to simulate things like abductions and mutilations and what have you. Now, many people, what's sad about this, there are people who have had actual ET contact who then get targeted with one of these hoaxed events so that they're confused about what's really going on with their actual encounter. So it's a very, very complicated picture. We could probably talk for 4 hours and I wouldn't begin to scratch the surface. Now, interestingly, people say, well, where do you get all this? I say, well, I have multiple people who've been in these programs who've told me this, but I first learned about it from a research paper that was done in 1988 or 89 by Martin Cannon, who lived in Los Angeles, and then from some people in Europe. So long before I got on the stage, this was actually being exposed, but it's been covered up by the UFO subculture. Wonder why? Well, because it's the truth. And, a CIA guy told me this years ago. The truth is so much more bizarre than the fiction that people are taking hook, line, and sinker that no one will believe it. And that's turned out to be the case. And so, unfortunately, it's a bit of a mind screw here, where people. There's so much information put out there that's deliberate false information that's designed to terrify people. And then the actual things that are going on are never heard about because they're sort of drowned out in the noise. The sound is lost for all the noise. And that's one of the things that the intelligence community concluded they had to do in the 50s. I have a document from the CIA from 1953 where they talked about this kind of counterintelligence operation, but also engaging, and I'm quoting here from the document, Disney Studios to create films and other entertainment that would basically make the subject look ridiculous. So this is something now 60 years in the making, this kind of, if you want to call it a nexus, a sort of a combination of false information that has been commingled and conflated with actual ET, real UFO events. So if you can't control, now think about this. let's say that you're in one of these intelligence community things and you really can't control the fact that ETs are visiting. How do you hide it? Here's what I was told in 1990. You hide it in plain sight. You put so much other false information out there that it's like looking for a gold nugget underneath a mountain of fool's gold. And unfortunately, very few people have been doing an assay. So it's very easy to deceive the public. And this is, the tenet. This is one of the chief things about counterintelligence, is that you have to be able to really trick the public, which unfortunately I think is what has happened. As a result, most people, have consumed enormous amounts of what I consider, really nasty false information that scares them about ETs, which I'm quite certain has been fabricated. And of course, a lot of people hate it when I say this because they say, oh, well, you can't prove that all civilizations visiting us are nice. I said, no, or that they're not hostile. I said, no, you can't prove a negative. Here's what we can prove. You and I are still on this planet, and there's been no overt attack. And given the fact that we've had weapon systems targeting and downing the ET craft for decades, remember the Roswell event was not an accidental crash. We had a new electronic, quote, radar system, which is a euphemism for a type of scalar electromagnetic system that caused those two spacecraft to crash. One obliterated itself north of Roswell, and the other continued on a westerly trajectory and impacted near Socorro, which is the one where there were some ETs that were recovered, some bodies. So the reality of this is that there has been a covert attempt to target real ET vehicles for many, many decades, and there's been also an attempt to put out enough propaganda and false information to scare the public so that they could be manipulated into the next level of war, which was it Douglas MacArthur in his last speech to the country said World War III will be interplanetary. That's actually in the congressional record, by the way. So a lot of these militarists and warmongers really want to see a way to convince people of a threat. And even, you can look at our movie. There's Ronald Reagan at the United Nations, and he, of course, got behind all the Star Wars stuff. Hundreds of billions wasted on that, where he says, hey, our job of uniting the world would be easier if we had a common alien threat to unite against. Well, why do we have to become united over something negative? Can't we become united over something positive and good? So this is, of course, who would that benefit? The military-industrial complex. And this is why Eisenhower said, beware the military-industrial complex. He was an anti-military. He was a five-star general, a World War II hero. But he had seen how the military-industrial complex had manipulated the system and corrupted it. And he ended up being a victim of it. I mean, a friend of mine who had worked with Eisenhower, and one of our witnesses, Steve Lubkin, an attorney who's since passed away, but his information's up on our website, his testimony, talked about this. But also Jackie Gleason, who was very good friends with President Eisenhower, his wife, Gleason's wife, told us that Eisenhower was very bitter about this and that he had been completely pushed aside over the control over these secret UFO-related projects. And essentially, no president since Eisenhower has had proper access control. Even if they've known about the issue, they haven't had proper control over the projects. And in that setting, you have a real risk to our democracy, which is what Eisenhower said in his last farewell speech. And by the way, this is in our movie. And then, years later, the day before 9/11, you have Donald Rumsfeld, a no liberal, him, and it's not like it's Abby Hoffman, who says there's $2.3 trillion in the defense budget over the years that we can't track, completely missing. Trillion, not billion. So, and this is the day before 9/11 when Donald Rumsfeld said that, a few months after the Disclosure Project National Press Club event. So, these are, I tell people, don't take my word for it. Listen to what Senator Inouye said. He said there's a secret government with its own Air Force, its own Navy, its own funding mechanism that's free from the law and above the law itself. I'm almost quoting word for word. His testimony and comment is in the film Sirius. So I tell people, if you don't want to believe me, fine, but listen to these people who were some of the most senior folks in history, and then also read the letter from the first CIA director. Most people don't know who that was, Admiral Roscoe Hillenkoetter. And you know what he said in this letter, dated 1961, the same year that Eisenhower was bewailing the plight and the criminal behavior of the military-industrial complex, is that Admiral Hillenkoetter, the first CIA director, says the secrecy around UFOs is a threat to our democracy. Not the UFOs. He says the secrecy around it. So I think people really have to pay attention. It's all out there, and we've tried to collect it. But in the meanwhile, there's this sort of juggernaut of, scary invasion films from outer space by Hollywood and video games and all kinds of things. And they're all designed, as far as I can tell, to brainwash people.